For the next hour, deepen your shade of green. This is the Shades of Green radio show, featuring the latest in technology, money-saving ideas, legislative updates, and all things green. The Shades of Green radio show is presented by the Green Alliance. Now here's your hosts, Paul Ira and Stan Hannell.
Good morning. This is Shades of Green radio show on KDWN 720 AM in Las Vegas. Our show is produced by the Green Alliance of Nevada, sponsored by NV Energy, and I am your host, Paul Ira. We also have in studio the now famous Stan Hannell from Drive Clean Nevada, Drive Clean Las Vegas, who is, Annette's not in the studio recording this morning, and we'll miss her. So if you have questions, you'd like to call in and talk with Stan or myself, our number is 702-257-5396. That's 702-257-KDWN. Today we're talking current events. So last week, Dr. Stephen Hawking passed away at 76 years young, having made important contributions to the scientific community as well as publicly living with, say that,
amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, right?
Easy for you to say, Steve.
A lot of practice.
I guess. So
Yeah.
that was a horrible thing, but what we want to talk about today, a couple of dumb guys talking about a very smart guy.
Yes.
And
We're going to try our best.
lots of contributions to this world that we live in, and we want to talk about that. Stan has a great background on Dr. Hawking, and we want to talk about that. So, Stan, tell us a little bit about the scientific community and how did he become a pop icon?
Right, yeah. The best way, if somebody wanted to really get a good look at his life story, he did write an autobiography in 2013 called My Brief History, and really
Was that authorized?
concise. Pardon?
Was that authorized?
Yes, it is his, yes. Got his name on it, and yeah, it's self-written, so it is his own words. And I just want to go to the very last page and talk about his contribution in his own words. And so he says, my early work showed that classical general relativity broke down its singularities in the Big Bang and for black holes. My later work has shown how quantum theory can predict what happens at the beginning and end of time. It has also been a glorious time to be alive and doing research in theoretical physics. I'm happy if I have added something to our understanding of the universe. But his life went way beyond that, and mostly because at the same time as he was making contributions, he was also suffering with this amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. It's a disease that attacks the sheaths of our nerve connections. So basically, they deteriorate, and then the connection between our brain and the nerve signals to the muscles in the body start to basically disconnect. And so it usually starts at the most extreme parts of the body, our fingers and our toes and that sort of thing, and works its way back. And normally when people are diagnosed with it, it's usually at a point where they've lost the ability to walk. They're usually in a wheelchair. Some even lose the ability to communicate, can't even move the larynx and the voice to make sounds other than quiet mumbles. So, and then the worst case is when your self-operating muscles start to go bad. So the things that sustain our breathing and our heart, those muscles start to go. And so usually within 4 years of being diagnosed, people pass away. But he was able to somehow mitigate it and lived with it for about 50 years in his wheelchair. 50 years. 50. So yeah, he was...
Any idea how did he accomplish that?
Yeah, that's what's such a mystery. I think he definitely had a purpose to his life. He was definitely driven to a passion for what he was doing, and he just kind of kept working. And the type of disease he had, I guess they were also able to mitigate it. He got a lot of help in medication too, and a lot of attention. He had nurses 24 hours around him for years. They were always monitoring him, so he had that care and got grants for that and support. But also just himself, he was one of these people that just had a very strong-willed mind and a need to know and a need to investigate and study. So that's what I think sustained him over that time. There are local groups if you're interested in ALS groups locally. If someone in your family is struggling with it, there are support groups in the area. Also, the Lou Ruvo Memory Center. They don't do things directly with that, but that's a good touch point to find out more information about local groups and how to get support for that. Basically, what had happened, he got it in his 20s, but it was very gradual decline after that. And initially, he started feeling clumsy. He was falling down, tripping, and he actually in his 20s was using a cane, and he went to the doctors and they said, well, lay off the beer. That was kind of, and so then
I got the same diagnosis.
But they but things continue to get worse. But at that point he also met his first wife, Jane Wild, and they were married, and so he went on. He had 3 kids, so as he was declining, he still had 3 children over about 8 years, and his wife was very instrumental in keeping things going, keeping the house going, doing things. But because of his situation, he was kind of trapped in his body, or he had a lot of time to think, and in a way, even though it was debilitating, it also helped him focus, I think, on what he was studying. So his main contribution at the time, he focused on astronomy and physics. He was actually born on the 300th anniversary of Galileo's death. So he felt that was kind of a signpost for him. But he also basically was interested in astronomy and cosmology. And as is, so cosmology is kind of the idea of doing modeling of how the universe works. And so we know about Einstein's theory of relativity. There's also a model of quantum mechanics that defines how tiny atoms work, and unfortunately, the mathematics between the two doesn't converge. So one of the things that he did in his life, and a lot of physicists are still trying to do today, is find the theory of everything, the one that explains the universe, how it operates on a very big scale, like the general theory of relativity, and also how things work at a very small scale, the quantum mechanics theory of quantum physics.
Which leads us with a lot to talk about when we come back. We're going to take a quick break from Shades of Green on KDWN. Be right back. Good morning, and we're back on KDWN 720 AM in Las Vegas. This is Shades of Green, and I'm your host, Paul Iro. We're here with Stan Hanel, and we're talking about Stephen Hawking, who passed away this last week. An incredible individual, a physicist who had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, since he was his late 20s. And most people live just a short few years afterwards, and he lived 50 years beyond the diagnosis. So we want to talk a little bit about how he was able to function, and how, not so much health-wise, but what kept him going, but how did he function on a daily basis? There's a lot of debilitating issues with ALS. So Stan had some personal involvement in keeping Mr. Hawkins on the roll, if you will.
Yeah, that was a wonderful experience. So basically, we're reading out of his book, Stephen Hawking's My Brief History, his autobiography that was written in 2013. And he said that basically he was finishing up his PhD in University of Cambridge in England, and that's about the time he was starting to get feeling clumsy. And he also met his first wife at that time too, and so she was helping him a lot in getting through that as he got. They were eventually married in July 1965, and basically after that he needed a job, so he applied as a research fellow at Caius College in Cambridge and got that job. And basically he was associated with Cambridge University in the UK from that point on, from his 20s on up through the end of his life. He was a researcher, a professor, an academic at Caius College and connected with Cambridge University. But he would travel back to the U.S., and so while he was still able to walk relatively well, he came out to Caltech, and he worked with Richard Feynman and some of the other theoretical physicists during the 1960s, and they were working on the Big Bang Theory at that time. The black holes were kind of new, and so that was his contributions. around a black hole, there's something called Hawking radiation now that is kind of the emanation of a black hole as it's collapsing. The energy is going around the rim or being expelled from the black hole is called Hawking radiation. So that was something that he was involved in. But basically, his career kept growing. He kept actually he was in the midst of working on these models of how the universe worked, and he mingled with some of the physicists of the time. And basically, in the 1970s, he was actually promoted into the Royal Society, which is recognized as a premier scientist around the world. And from that, so he continued to lecture, and he had graduate students that could assist him in both writing and teaching. And so that helped a lot. Even though he was in a wheelchair by this time, he still had graduate student assistants. And then as he got worse, basically he was started to need more nursing assistance. So he usually would have a nurse living with the husband and wife and their kids that could look in on him at night. In 1985, he went to CERN in Switzerland and developed pneumonia, and that's when things really got bad. So he had to have a tracheotomy in order to save his life, and at that point, he lost the ability to speak. In the past, his voice was starting to slur during the 80s, and he was having to talk with a lab assistant who would translate and write down what he was trying to say and help him with publishing his works. At that point, he thought his career was over in 1985, and that's kind of where this equipment that we recognize that he had on his wheelchair came into play. There was a company in Sunnyvale, California, that was founded by Walt and Ginger Waltos. And Walt had been a rocket scientist. He'd worked on the space shuttle. He worked for United Technologies. And then his wife's mother also had contracted Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. And so Walt and Ginger basically started up a company in the early 1980s to try and come up with computer-based technologies that would help people be able to communicate still and help basically her mother at the time. But they wound up commercializing that and helping other people that they knew in the region that also had ALS. And so if you remember during the 1980s, the first microprocessors were just coming out. The first IBM PC, the Apple II, had been around, the TRS-80. So the very first personal computers were coming around. Plus chips were being made in the semiconductor industry that could do voice synthesis. And so a voice synthesizer is something that's a collection of like 64 basic sounds we call phonemes or phonetic sounds. And this could be ba, and basically the chips or the software could take that collection of 64 sounds, assign an 8-bit binary number to each one, and then through a computer string them together and output it to an audio voice synthesizer and create speech.
You mean we only make 64 basic sounds?
Yeah, approximately. I mean, that's kind of the general thing. And so as you can hear, as you remember from his voice, this was during the 1980s, that technology was kind of limited at the time. Now we work with Alexa and Siri and Cortana, and we have those things
where they morphed from.
Where they morphed from, yeah, they're much improved now. But back in the 1980s, it was kind of just 64 basic sounds plus inflections. So you could also make it, sounds have like a musical quality to it. You could have 4 different levels of inflection. So da 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 da, it's kind of thing, and that would give you the ability to kind of show emotions. So there's basically he talks about it in his book how that happened. So he said, I continue to get worse, and one of the symptoms of my progressing illness was prolonged choking fits. In 1985, on a trip to CERN, CERN, European Organization for Nuclear Research in Switzerland, I caught pneumonia. I was rushed to the Cantonal Hospital and put on a ventilator. The doctors at the hospital thought I was so far gone that they offered to turn off the ventilator and end my life. But Jane refused and had me flown back by air ambulance to Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. The doctors there tried hard to get me back to how I had been before, but in the end, they had to perform a tracheotomy. And that's basically an incision in the throat to basically allow you to breathe through your throat area. Before my operation, my speech had been getting more slurred, so only people who knew me well could understand me, but at least I could communicate. I wrote scientific papers by dictating to a secretary, and I gave seminars through an interpreter who repeated my words more clearly. However, the tracheotomy removed my ability to speak altogether. For a time, the only way I could communicate was to spell out words letter by letter by raising my eyebrows when someone pointed to a right letter on a spelling card.
This is going to take a while.
Yes, right, yeah. And so it is pretty difficult to carry on a conversation like that, let alone write a scientific paper. However, a computer expert in California named Walt Waltos heard of my plight and sent me a computer program that he had written called Equalizer. This allowed me to select words from a series of menus on the screen by pressing a switch in my hand. I now used another of his programs called Words Plus keyboard emulator, which I control by a small sensor on my eyeglasses that responds to my cheek movement. When I've built up what I want to say, I send it to the speech synthesizer. At first, I just ran the Equalizer program on a desktop computer. Then David Mason of Cambridge Adaptive Communications fitted a small personal computer and a speech synthesizer to my wheelchair. My computers are now supplied by Intel. This system allows me to communicate much better than I could before, and I can manage up to 3 words a minute. I can either speak what I have written or save it on a disk. I can then print it out or call it back and speak it sentence by sentence. Using this system, I've written 7 books and a number of scientific papers. I've also given a number of scientific and popular talks. They have been well received, which I think is due large part to the quality of the speech synthesizer made by Speech Plus. That was in another company in the Bay Area during the 1980s. One's voice is very important. If you have a slurred voice, people are likely to treat you as mentally deficient.
Which we know he was. I understand also that this is what he used to lose his British accent.
Yes, because it came, we'll go a little more where that came from, but because it was made in America, it had kind of a robotic sound a little bit, but it also had an American accent, so he kind of lost his British accent. But he goes on to say, this synthesizer was by far the best I had heard because it varies the intonation and didn't speak like one of the Daleks from Doctor Who.
We all love Doctor Who, but we'll talk about him when we come back. The Shades of Green on KDWN. And we're back to Shades of Green on KDWN. I'm your host, Paul Ira. We're here with Stan Hannell. We're talking Steve Hawking, who passed away this last week. For those of you who'd like to read more about him, there's several books, of course, and there's a brief history of time. There's an authorized autobiography. That's a joke about unauthorized autobiography by Stephen Wright. Then there's a briefer history of time, as well as the grand design. And he talks about time and space. He's maybe one of the great authors of time and space, but had Lou Gehrig's disease and still functioned for 50 years with a disease that usually takes most people in just a few short years. One of the things that enabled him to continue to function was this high-tech chair. And we talked a little bit about his voice and his voice simulation equipment and software and what have you, and that's tied to his wheelchair. But there's so much more to it. Stan, tell us a little more about that wheelchair and the equipment that was on it and how it was built.
Right, yeah. So it started as just a regular motorized wheelchair, and if you've seen very similar to what today, you usually have a joystick mounted on one side, and it basically allows you to go forward, reverse, and then by turning the joystick left or right, you can move it that way. So when he was in the chair, when he got the communication equipment was added onto that, and so electric motorized wheelchair has a big battery in it to drive the motors, and then this particular system was in a little box that was actually attached to the base, and also had a self-contained battery that would operate the computer system. Then on his where normally you'd have kind of his lap area, they mounted a display screen that he could see right in front of him to see an array of letters. So you can think of, there's 26 letters in the alphabet. This had an array of 6 rows of I think it was 5 or 6 letters each, and so that was how he would start. And the display screen actually had a cursor that would kind of move back and forth on the screen. So it would highlight the top half of the screen and then the bottom and start alternating. And he would freeze the screen, the cursor, by clicking the switch. So you had 6 rows of say, different letters kind of arranged in most frequent use pattern. And then after he clicks, say, the top half of the screen, it would freeze the cursor. And then the cursor would change to go line by line for the 3 rows in the top half of the screen. So it would start scanning those back and forth. He would click his switch a second time. That would freeze it on that row. And then the cursor would shrink down to pixel size and just go to each letter in that row. So it would take him 3 clicks of a switch to select a letter from the alphabet, and then from there the screen would change again, and you'd get a grid array with words beginning with that letter he selected. So you'd have, say he selects the letter A, you would have basically a grid of 36 words or 30 words that all began with the letter A. And then the same thing would happen. He would scan the front. The scanning cursor would highlight the top half, top 3 rows, bottom 3 rows, back and forth. Click the switch, then it would go to the row. It would scan the either top 3 rows, 1 row at a time, or the bottom 3 rows, 1 at a time. And he would click on the switch a second time, and then once it hit that row, it would go word by word in that row. He would click on that, and he put the word together. That would be put into a workspace that was kind of at the bottom of his display screen, and he could basically put together a sentence, and then he could save those sentences into paragraphs, put paragraphs, or create a whole page, pre-compose a speech if he was giving a speech to people, and then just click on the cursor 1 line at a time, and it would go out through the voice synthesizer. So it was an amazing piece of equipment, and it was the first time anybody had really made that system portable and put it on a computer. So Words Plus, the company itself, continued to try to do that for other people too. And during the 80s, what was good is we were just starting to see the first laptops during the latter part of the 1980s. The IBM PC had already come out, several versions of it, and so the laptops really made it portable. And so one of the jobs I had when I was working with them is to take apart the laptop computers and find the internal speaker and add a little amplifier board in there, and then basically run that out to an audio headphone jack or a external speaker jack that we could actually use the computer with something called Smooth Talker that would use the internals of the IBM PC to generate the speech. And so that was a challenge to do that for a lot of other people too. And so the company actually did succeed. They went about 30 years, and they were purchased by a competitor called Prentke-Romich that they kind of had an agreement with. So the company existed from the early 1980s up to about early 2000s or so. And what was interesting, getting back to Professor Hawking's voice, that was developed by a company called Digital Equipment Company. They had a voice synthesizer program called Deck Talk, and Speech Plus, which was another company in Sunnyvale that Words Plus worked with, had managed to make that portable. They developed some chips, put that all in a box, and made a portable voice synthesizer that you could connect to a laptop computer. What's interesting about that set of phonemes that makes his voice, it was called Perfect Paul. So, and so they basically, I know, right? Yeah. And so it it was the Deck Talk voice, and they had several different types of voices. So by changing the quality of the phonemes, the set of phonemes, they had another voice called Beautiful Betty that was more for women, and then they had another set that was more higher pitched that was more for children. So you could kind of get your own voice, customize that. Nowadays we have Alexa and Siri and Cortana and all these voice synthesis systems, but they're also voice recognition. So basically, you can actually interact with a smart voice nowadays, and the quality is very, very good. It's a funny story that Hawking, as the synthesizer technology got better, he could actually have substituted a more natural-sounding voice, even one with an English accent, that would have been closer to his original voice, but he chose not to. He said that was kind of his identity, and he wanted to kind of keep that. People recognized that earlier Speech Plus voice. So it's kind of interesting, that story about that.
So he sounded digital, and he kept it that way.
Yeah, he wanted that particular, he was known for that, and so when it was distinctive when something came up on television. Sound.
So when you hear it, you kind of knew it was him talking.
Yes, yeah, and it would kind of underscore it. It was kind of interesting how that all kind of worked into pop, into the pop culture, and he wound up being on The Simpsons in a cartoon form, and he was on Star Trek. They did an episode where he was playing poker with Einstein and some other theoretical physicists kind of in a simulation of the future. So he actually wound up, and he was on, I think, the Big Bang Theory as well, and some other pop icons. So he kind of took over for Carl Sagan, who passed away in 1996, in being kind of a touchstone for popular science.
Billions and billions of stars.
Yes, right. Yeah, and trying to explain, complex things.
And we're back on KDWN, Shades of Green. I'm your host, Paul Ira. We have Stan Hannell here in the studio. We're talking about Dr. Stephen Hawking, who passed away last week. Before we get too far into this, we've got some announcements. We want to make sure everyone remembers that Greenfest is coming up April 21st from 9 to 5. That's a lot of fun. Last year, how many people were there last year?
Gosh, it was combined with the Tour de Summerland, so we had like 60,000 people come through that one day on that Saturday.
It's a big event, and it's the biggest Earth Day event in the Valley, sponsored by Green Alliance. And for those of you who are not familiar with Green Alliance, you can go on greenalliancenv.org, become a member. Students join free. We're always looking for volunteers to help us put the Green Fest together and tear it down afterwards as well.
That's a big word. It's a lot of work.
At Green Fest, we have music and beer.
Yes.
For those of you who are into those kind of things, it's a great thing for children. Now that I mentioned we have a beer garden, the kids have a great time.
Yeah, there's bounce houses and a lot of things that keep them busy.
Face painting, all kinds of things going on. There are lots of booths with green products, sustainable products. There's lots of food, music. It goes on all day. It truly is a festival atmosphere, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. You can't hardly go there without picking up some fine trinkets and buying some good things to eat and some repurposed products and help us save the planet. Also coming up soon is the Nevada Electric Highway update. Tell us about that, Hawthorne Station.
Right. So we've talked about this on the show in the past. The Governor's Office of Energy, Brian Sandoval, is trying to speed up the ability of plug-in electric cars to travel between Las Vegas and Reno and through the rural parts of the state by putting DC fast charge stations along these highways. And so the first leg of the highway that was announced a couple of years ago was to connect Las Vegas to Reno every 100 miles. So that meant putting a DC fast charge station at Beatty, Tonopah, Hawthorne, Fallon, and then into Reno, so that we could go back and forth. The charging times would be like about 20 minutes to do about 100 miles to get you to the next station instead of 3 to 4 hours with a level 2 charger. So the Hawthorne one just is up and running. There's already one in Beatty and one in Fallon. The last one to be completed will hopefully be in Tonopah before the end of the year. But the one in Hawthorne that just is up and running now is at 410th Street, Hawthorne, Nevada, 89415. It's actually a rest stop that's part of NDOT administers that as well. The one in Beatty is at Eddy World Gasoline Station. It's at 900 East US 95. And the one in Fallon is the Fox Peak gas station. It's administered by the Paiute Shoshone tribes up there at a convenience store. So at 615 East Williams Avenue in Fallon. So right now, with some of the new cars that are coming out, the Bolt EV from Chevrolet has a 220-mile range. So that one right now could travel the highway even without the Tonopah station involved. They could make it from Beatty to Hawthorne.
So get your electric cars. We're giving you the ability to drive all over the country with that. That's a great thing. Last week we had Angela Quick and Gene Hoppert from First Nevada in studio talking about the robotics competitions and education that's going on in the school. And that's coming to a head, if you will, at Thomas and Mack this weekend. March 23rd and 24th is the first robotics competition at Thomas and Mack, Friday and Saturday. And if you've missed the previous shows, you can listen to them at Shades of Green.
Right.
That wasn't right. That was for our previous shows. But don't miss this competition of First Robotics, 9 to 5, isn't it?
Right, yeah. I think it starts around that time. It's Friday and Saturday, And what's great is some of our local high schools, Cimarron Memorial especially, is a real powerhouse in that competition. They're competing against world-class high school teams at this regional competition. So you'll see people from overseas as well as locally, and the winner goes on to the World Championships in a couple of weeks. So we're going to be cheering our teams. We'll have, I know each of the schools usually has a family in the bleachers as well as cheerleaders, and it's just like a regular sports competition. But these guys do a great job every year, and so I think also Southwest Career and Technical Academy usually is there, and some other local high schools.
Well, it's so much fun that Gene said people say, well, we'll go down for a couple hours, and they end up spending half a day there. So definitely join in with the fun there. It's good education for the kids. Some of the numbers they gave us last week that still amazing to me. 100% of the kids that get involved in this program graduate from high school.
That's amazing.
Now, that says a lot about education. That says a lot about this program. So go out and support these folks. They're doing a great thing. So back to Dr. Hawkins. I was reading online here about an interview he did with the New York Times back in 2004, and they were prompting him to tell them how smart he was. And he says, despite his undoubted intelligence, Hawking was modest about his gifts. When asked in 2004 interview with the New York Times what his IQ is, Hawking gave a curt reply. He said, I have no idea. People who boast about their IQ are losers. The interviewer passed him on how that could know if he really is a genius physicist, as was often said. And he replied, the media need superheroes in science, just as in every sphere of life, but there is really a continuous range of abilities with no clear dividing line, Hawking said. Said, are you saying you are not a genius? Asked the interviewer. Hawking says, I hope I'm near the upper end of the range, which I suspect he was. So IQ is just a simple measurement of ability to think, possibly, and has nothing to do with actual knowledge or wisdom. So
yeah, that's great. Yeah.
So there are a lot of smart folks out there. Dr. Hawking's chair, we were talking about that and all the equipment on that, which helped him function and use this great intelligence of his. Did you have any more about that, Stan?
Basically, we kind of summarized it all. It had a computer system, motorized wheelchair. Initially, he could drive the. You would see his hands kind of crisscrossed. He would be able to drive the motor with his left hand, which had the strength in it, but with his right hand initially, he could just tap with one finger on a big paddle switch to activate the computer system in place of a keyboard. Later in life, his ability to even use that one finger to tap out deteriorated, and so they moved the sensor. Any binary muscle movement you can make, you could turn into a switch activation. So one of his lab assistants took an infrared sensor, mounted a wire onto his eyeglasses, and basically pointed at a cheek muscle. So if he could flex that cheek muscle, the light would bounce off it and activate a switch movement. So that was what he was doing at the very end. And sometimes even then, flexing that cheek muscle was slow. So he would maybe only be able to get one word a minute or so out of his processor. But he had the time, and he just kept on. That's what's so admirable about his life, is he didn't give up.
So if you think life is hard,
Right.
Go look up Stephen Hawking on the internet and take a look at how he had to function and the great things that he accomplished. I always say that when I think life is tough, I think about our military men and where are they sleeping and where are they
Right.
taking a shower, and then I realize how great we've got it.
We got it good out
we
here in
have
Las
no
Vegas.
problems.
Right.
Life goes on, make the best of it, and he's a great example of achieving and being all you can be. Great man, and we wanted to give him a tribute this week.
Yeah.
For his
and
great work.
And also acknowledge all the folks that struggle with that in their daily life these days. And there is help through the local ALS organizations. Just Google online ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, and there is community out there that is willing to help.
So let's help our community, and it's been a great show, and our tribute to Dr. Hawkins. We love the man. He was wonderful. We're going to miss him.
Yes.
So thanks for joining in. Have a great week out there, and keep it green. And this is Paul and Stan on Shades of Green, KDWN.